to get started in the next minute or two. So I see there's a feedback. Okay, excellent, very good. So stay patient with us. We'll get started in a minute or two. I know some of you are getting your lunch in order, and we should getting our webinar in order in the next bit.
You are now unmuted.
Thank you for everyone's patience. We're trying to get our presenters' microphone working. Call-in options are giving us a little issue at the moment, so I apologize for the delay. But we should be getting started shortly. So hang tight. Thank you.
Razi, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, Steve. I hear you.
So I just connected with the regular pin, not the presenter pin.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that, Steve. I apologize for that miscommunication on my part. So just one more mic check. Everyone in the chat, do you hear me right now? This is Razi. Do you hear me? Yes. Okay. And then Steve, if you could just say something so we confirm that we hear the presenter.
Okay. This is Steve Romalewski. Can everyone hear me?
Okay. Excellent. That's what I'm talking about. Thank you very much. I apologize for the delay. But as everyone knows, whenever you're dealing with that little tech, sometimes things come up. So I want to thank again, Steve, for being here today. I want to get right into this, but just a couple of reminders. We plan to have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. Feel free to send in any questions via the chat box throughout the presentation, and then we'll have time to ask our presenter to answer your questions at the end of his presentation. Also, this is part of the New York State GIS Association webinar series. Really been rolling strong with each month presentation. I apologize for last week's cancellation of the presentation. For those of you that were registered, we had to cancel due to the presenter being impacted from the federal shutdown, federal government shutdown. So myself, just a brief intro. My name is Razi Kassed. I'm a co-chair of the Professional Development Committee with the New York State GI Association. I'm also a project manager with a company called Eagleview out in Rochester, New York. I'm excited to have Steve today here as a presenter. You know, Steve, I've always seen a lot of his content through the GIS listserv. You know, read a lot of his articles and blogs and posts. He's always had a ton of really interesting content, and a lot of that comes with the visualizations, with the mapping and data analysis that he does with his team. So I was very excited when Steve, you know, made time for our webinar in his schedule. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Steve to get into his bio and presentation. Thank you very much. And Steve, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Rosie. Thanks, everyone, for being on the webinar. Glad to be here. Honored to be able to give some information about what we're doing with a coalition of other organizations around the country on the 2020 census. So I work at the City University of New York Graduate Center, which serves a number of roles within the CUNY system, but I work at a research center, the Center for Urban Research. And for the past 12, 13 years, my team has been able to develop a number of online mapping applications and work on a number of other GIS-related projects within CUNY, with people within CUNY and with outside partner organizations, and for other projects of interest to our group. And in 2010, we were able to develop an online mapping service to help organizations focus their outreach efforts leading up to the 2010 census, to highlight where so-called hard-to-count communities were based on data from the Census Bureau itself. And so for the 2020 census, this time around, a coalition of civil rights organizations and philanthropic funders have asked us to do something similar, and so that's what I'll talk about during the webinar. But and hopefully people can see the slide that I just switched. Rosie, can you see that?
I see it. Looks great.
Okay, good. So first, just some background and context about the 2020 census. I'm sure everyone has been reading the news, seeing the reports about various issues and challenges related to the 2020 census. And this time around, there are new challenges and issues. There have always been challenges with trying to count everyone in the country. But this time around, there have been a number of institutional setbacks. The recent government shutdown, of course, that has impacted the planning for the census. There's been funding issues. Only recently was there a full-time census director confirmed by the Senate, and it's, you know, to do that so late in the game is very risky in terms of having someone leading the effort and leading the charge in Congress to make sure there's adequate funding. Anyway, and then of course the census questionnaire, there have been a number of issues. The biggest one is the last-minute proposal by the Department of Commerce to include a question on citizenship on the census. And of course, if you're familiar with working with American Community Survey data, there's information on the American Community Survey, a question that's asked about citizenship. So, excuse me. And so in some ways, we already have that information. And with a question like this on the decennial census included so late in the game without any real testing on the decennial census, aside from any political implications of that or you know, community concerns, the decennial census is a one-time thing. If it's wrong, or if it's impacted by a change in the questionnaire that impacts the public's interest in responding, and we collect data that is either inaccurate or missing people or counting people incorrectly in some parts of the country versus others, that will impact political representation, that will impact funding, that will impact the baseline that further surveys are rely on the decennial census going forward for the next decade. And so it's a big concern. And also, the lawsuits that are happening around the census questionnaire, the citizenship question, they're moving through the courts, but it's unclear if the courts will decide or there'll be a resolution of this by the time the actual mailings have to be done and questionnaires have to be printed. So it's a big question mark as to the impact that this will have, whether there's a citizenship question on the questionnaire or not. A lot of the controversy around it has impacted the public's perception of the census and perhaps eroded their trust in the census, decennial census program. So we'll see what happens. It's a big open-ended question. There also have been some changes in how the questionnaire will collect information about race and ethnicity, in particular for people who check the box if they are Black or African American or white. They'll be able to add additional ethnicities, so that'll be a change. And there was some earlier controversy or a question about whether the Census Bureau would add elements of the questions to check off whether you're LGBTQ or if you're from Middle Eastern or North African ethnicity, and those are not going to be included this time around. So we'll see what that means in terms of the public's sense of the census, decennial census questionnaire. And then the other big issue is the Census Bureau is hoping that that most households will respond or submit their answers to the census questionnaire not by mail but online, and that could help reduce costs and also improve the self-response, but it is a big unknown. Hasn't been fully tested, and there are all sorts of issues around responding online in terms of privacy and confidentiality and the technical reliability of an online system, as we experienced this morning with technical issues around the webinar. Lots of things could go wrong, and so that's a big concern. So having said all that, the silver lining, I think, in all of this is that compared to 2010 and perhaps earlier decennial census outreach efforts, the organizations interested in a fair and accurate count have started their efforts much earlier than before. And so the philanthropic community that's providing funding to local organizations that are doing outreach around the census, civil rights and other organizations that are interested in and have been talking to Congress about making sure the census is adequately funded and in policy discussions about the types of questions, they've been starting their efforts much earlier. And so that's one reason why there's been such media interest in the census now, a year or so out, whereas in 2010, for example, when we developed our online mapping application, it was towards the end of 2009, so right around the corner. But now we've had this map application online for about a year, and organizations have been very active in addressing issues around the 2020 census for some time now. So hopefully that will help alleviate and make sure that trusted partners, when the questionnaires and online response options come out in spring of 2020, will be able to have a much stronger message about the importance of being counted. Because, of course, as I mentioned, the census data is foundational in a number of different ways, and so it's really critical that the count be done fairly and accurately. So one thing that we have been helping with that is an online map application that highlights hard-to-count communities. And I think it's important just to point out how the enumeration process works. Maybe some of you are intimately familiar with this, maybe not. But so in order to kind of explain what we mean by hard to count. So enumeration process happens with the decennial census in two phases. There's the self-response effort, which the Census Bureau sends out a mailing to almost every household in the country. This time around, the mailing, for the most part, won't include the actual questionnaire. It will just have a link to a website people can go to submit their questions, their responses. And then you'll have the option of getting the questionnaire, and some households will get the questionnaire, but most people will be urged to fill out the information online. And that's the self-response phase where, generally speaking, based on research that's been done by the Census Bureau and others, that's where the most reliable information comes in. That's the least expensive way of collecting the information. But not every household will self-respond, and they won't self-respond for a variety of reasons. And in some areas, more households won't self-respond than in other areas. And so the Census Bureau knows that, and so they're planning already to conduct the second phase, which is the so-called non-response follow-up phase, or NARFU. You may have heard it by NRFU. And that's where they hire a small army of people nationwide to go door to door and collect information, because the Census Bureau's charge, of course, is to count everyone. So if you don't self-respond, they come out and they count for you. And so that's the phase where the greatest risk comes in that people will be missed, or that people won't be counted accurately, especially if there's a citizenship question on the form. And so areas where there have been a large share of households in 2010 that did not mail back their forms, that's what we're considering the hardest to count areas going forward. And I'll show how we've visualized that on the map and what that means in terms of outreach and the like. So I'd ask the question, when you say before April 1, 2020, when do the questionnaires begin to be sent out? The Census Bureau already this month has started the enumeration process in a remote area of Alaska. And then the bulk of the mailings and the questionnaires will start to be sent out in March, I believe. I'm sorry, they haven't started yet. In 2020, I'm a year ahead of time. In 2020, January, they'll start the enumeration in a remote part of Alaska, and then in March or so of 2020, they'll start to send out in waves the mailings that will ask people to respond with where they are or where they were on April 1st, and that will continue for several weeks after April 1st. So here's a screen that shows map. I'll go through the map with some screenshots via these slides, and if we have time, I can do an interactive demo of the map. We've actually just this week added some new data and features to the map. So this is a nationwide view, and you can see that the census tracts that are highlighted in yellow to orange to dark red are the worst 20% of the census tracts that had the lowest share of households that self-responded in 2010. So for lack of a better metric, in consultation with census experts and civil rights organizations, that's the threshold that we used to highlight areas that are considered hard to count. And that doesn't mean that, number one, the remaining households didn't get counted, but it does mean that those are the areas where there was the greatest risk of people being missed or undercounted. And it also doesn't mean that in areas that you don't see color shaded on the map that there wasn't any follow-up enumeration. There was in virtually every census tract in the country. There were a few where 100% of the households mailed back their forms, but not many. So the Census Bureau needs to do this non-response follow-up virtually everywhere. But these are the highlighted tracts are the areas where we expect that it'll be the hardest to count. So the map provides this information. It gives you the ability to zoom in and search for areas in a variety of different ways. And actually, I'll go to the next slide, which highlights a congressional district. And actually, the information on this slide is, I forget if there was a change in Congressional District 20, but we've updated the map through contact information from ProPublica and others to show the 116th Congress and the new representatives. But anyway, it highlights one way to view the information is to see by congressional district where the hard-to-count areas are, and you could also click on a link to get a PDF of this map. So if you're talking to your congressional representatives and urging them to support adequate funding for the census, this can come in handy, and there's contact information there as well. And then some basic statistics on the left about the share of households that mailed back their questionnaire in 2010, and therefore the share of households that needed to be counted in person, and also the share of the district's current population that lives in those hard-to-count tracts to get a sense, a gauge of what the effort might take this time around to make sure that as many people as possible self-respond. But then you could also zoom in, and you can see information on the map for every census tract in the country, not just the ones that are color-shaded. But for each tract, we highlight and show the mail return rate in 2010, so the share of households that mailed back their forms, and therefore a sense of how much effort will be needed to reach out to the ones that didn't mail back their forms. We also have some information. This slide shows that we have statistics from the Federal Communications Commission, but we just updated this, the information about internet access using the latest 2013 to 17 American Community Survey estimates at the tract level and higher. I just lost something here. Can people still see my slides? I can't see my slides.
Steve, I'm not sure what happened. We might have to bring that presentation back up.
Okay, I'm not sure how.
I'm not sure what happened there. Yeah, sorry about that. It's loading up right now. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened.
On my end, it still says, please wait for the presentation to load. I'm not sure if it's loaded on your screen or not, but I still don't see a presentation.
Can people see the map? I just shared my screen.
It just came up on my screen right now.
Okay, so let's
Sorry about that.
Jump in and use the interactive map. So let's we'll go to Congressional District 20, where we just were, and I'll switch this to the tract level view. I'll zoom in. I guess it was up here in Schenectady, and we'll click on this particular tract. And so this one, almost 3,000 people live there. It's going to be, again, based on the latest ACS estimates. Just under 60% of the households mailed back their questionnaires in 2010. So a big chunk of that, of those 790 or so households, assuming it was the same number or similar number in 2010, had to be counted in person. So almost just over 27% of those households don't have adequate internet access. They have no access or dial-up only. And so that's a big concern. The internet access information is critical because on the one hand, if a tract is likely to have a large share of households self-responding but has poor internet access, they could want to self-respond as much as possible, but it's going to be a challenge because then they're going to have to deal with either the Census Bureau to make sure they get a questionnaire, or they're going to have to access the online information some other way. I will point out that we've also included the locations of public libraries on the map, so you can use those libraries, and you can click on the library on the map and get information about where it is. And the American Library Association, the New York State Library Association are very eager in terms of having libraries be a resource for people that don't have good internet access. to go there and access the free, use the free Wi-Fi services in the public libraries. Of course, they're hoping to get funding support to make sure that they're able to withstand the interest in doing that, but that is an option. And I should point out also that when you get the mailing from the Census Bureau, there'll be not only a link, but also a unique ID that you can use, but you do not have to use that unique ID, according to the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau says you could just go to the link, fill out the information, and they expect to be able to check in real time as you're entering the information whether someone from your household has already entered the information and therefore you don't need to, or if this is a new submission. Again, that is a hopeful way of increasing self-response, but it's also not fully tested, and so we'll see how it goes. But you will be able to access the link to submit your information from anywhere, a public library, on your smartphone, etc. And then for each tract, so let's look at a different tract. So here is a tract where it's going to be just about 28%, so a little over a quarter of the households don't have adequate internet access. So, 70% or so have good internet access, so that's pretty good. However, let's also look at the information about the population of that tract that may be at risk of being undercounted, regardless of what the 2010 mail return rate was. So we have information here that you could access, again, for every tract in the country and also for other levels of geography, every county, every state, every congressional district, for people at risk of being undercounted. And so the categories are people of color, kids under 5, which interestingly enough have the greatest net undercount rate of any other age group. People are not really sure why, but children under 5 tend to be undercounted at higher rates than others. Renters, which the Census Bureau says is the largest or the strongest predictor of areas that will not self-respond in large numbers if there's a concentration of renter households. Crowded households, single-parent households, people who are immigrants, people who have incomes near or below the poverty level, people with limited English proficiency, and people living in multifamily housing. So in this tract, there's 30% of the population is black in combination with other races or alone, 11% Asian, 14% Hispanic. There's 6% of the tract is children under 5. That's about average. Renters, half of the households are renters, so that's a concern. Single-parent households, 22% of them. Quarter of the population was born outside the United States, and most of those relatively recently. Low-income populations, so more than half the population of the tract is either in poverty or near poverty, so that's a concern. And then people with limited English proficiency, not too many of them. But when you look at these other characteristics, the reason this information is so helpful is that it not only is it more current than the 2010 mail return rates, but it also gives you a sense of the concerns that people have, the priorities in their lives. They're single-parent households, they have kids, they're renting, maybe they live in multifamily housing, and it's not easy for them to get mail sometimes. And so these are challenges, real-world challenges that people will have in terms of trying to get the information about the census and then actually make the effort to go online or go to a place that has internet access or to fill out the questionnaire and mail it back. And that's just the self-response phase. And then the next phase is if they don't do all of those things, then an enumerator from the Census Bureau will come to their door at some point, and they're going to make several visits to try to get the information in person. And so you will have to have trust in your government that the census information is confidential. It's okay to open your door to an enumerator and provide them with the information. And these days, that is a very real concern that a lot of people don't have that trust for a variety of reasons. and they are reluctant to open up their door to someone from the government. So that's why it's really important to communicate all of this data about local populations and where hard-to-count areas are and why they may be hard to count based on the population characteristics. So so-called trusted voices, so local community organizations, religious institutions, schools, nonprofit groups, social service agencies can provide, and local elected officials, business agencies, business associations can provide the message to their neighbors, to people attending meetings of a variety of types, etc., about the importance of the census, the importance of participating in the census, and filling out the form in whatever way, preferably online up front, but if you don't, then providing the information to a census enumerator. And so we hope that this interactive map will help with those efforts. A couple of things to emphasize. So we're actually in the process of thinking about how to enhance the map by not only showing information here on the left-hand panel about the populations at risk of being undercounted, but actually adding this information as mapped layers so you can see where the concentrations are of these different population groups and perhaps also where combinations of those population groups are located. And we're exploring different cluster analysis that we can use and provide that information on the map as well. And then continue to update the data. So we just updated it with ACS estimates through 2017, and by the end of this year, we should have information and we'll be able to add that online for the period through 2018. And then when the actual census enumeration process begins, the Census Bureau in 2010 was able to provide weekly statistics on the share of households down to the census tract level that had filled out their forms and mailed their questionnaires back in. And we published that information on our map in 2010 so organizations could make updated decisions about where to refocus their efforts. So if a couple of tracts over here had a high participation rate, we're not going to worry about them as much, but we're going to focus over here instead on the east side of town, let's say, where there's a number of tracts where people still haven't filled out their forms. This time, and I should point out that according to the groups on the ground, was very helpful. This time around, because the preferred mode of response will be online, the Census Bureau expects that they'll have basically real-time information, not just weekly, but real-time information about the share of households that have self-responded. And so we're in discussions with the Bureau about how to incorporate that real-time information into this hard-to-count map. So it'll be updated on certainly more frequently than a weekly basis. We'll see what that actually means. So we'll have that information as well, so that'll enhance the get out the count efforts from these trusted partner organizations. And then just a couple of things about the map itself. So if you've zoomed into an area and you've highlighted a census tract that you're interested in, you can then click the share link and copy that URL. And then if you open up a new browser, which hopefully people can see, you zoom to that, you enter that link, or you share it on Facebook or via email or Twitter or whatever, it'll zoom directly to that location. And then we also, like I mentioned, have information about the county at the county level. So for each county, statistics about the population at risk of being undercounted, as well as where the hard-to-count areas are based on the 2010 now return rate. And then also for state legislative districts, both upper or lower, New York, the Assembly and Senate. And this information is updated for the current legislators. So if you're trying to reach out to your elected officials so that they can help with the get out the count efforts, you could use this if you don't know who your representatives are to get the information directly and also provide them with statistics that they may not know about their districts in terms of the hard-to-count populations within it. And these days, very different from in 2010, everyone makes maps online. It's much easier to do than it's ever been before, and so this is not the only online map that provides this type of information. The Census Bureau itself has an application that they call their ROAM application, ROAM. I think it stands for Response Outreach something map, and they use a slightly different threshold for areas that are hard to count. They don't call them hard to count, they call them propensity for low response, low self-response, and they've developed this statistical model to try to predict those areas. And we are continually evaluating their low response model to see how well we think it is in terms of incorporating that information. We may incorporate that information at some point into this online hard-to-count application. But the philanthropic funders and civil rights groups knew that the Census Bureau was developing their own application, but they weren't sure when or if they would actually develop it in time, and they wanted to have something that, so this hard-to-count application, that they could help shape and coordinate and provide information that perhaps the Census Bureau may not be interested in providing. So things like the locations of public libraries and the legislative district contact information and potentially other resources that we might end up adding to this, local census offices, information on nonprofits or other service providers that or get out to count local resources. So we'll be continuing to update this throughout the course of the year and as it gets to 2020. And then also there's a lot of information that's available from these organizations about the importance of the census, the risks to the 2020 census, and the like. And so we have a resources page here where so it highlights a couple of these organizations. So the Census Counts 2020 effort nationwide. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is the main organization that's providing leadership, as their name implies, on the importance of the census, and they've produced a number of fact sheets and have been leading the charge against the citizenship question, and so you can access a lot of that information from their page. And then also the Census Project has been working for decades to monitor the census and the efforts to make sure it's funded adequately and the like, and so this is another resource to work with. And you could also see the different stakeholders that are involved and reach out to these organizations as well. So I think that's pretty much it as far as the map itself goes. Hopefully this has been helpful and useful. And let me see if I could switch back to the page, and I'm happy to answer questions and provide other information if need be.
Yeah, excellent, Steve. We can get going into the question and answer. I can read the question, and then you can sort of address it just so we have that recorded.
Okay, sure.
So we'll go ahead with our first question here. Just to answer, yes, Julia, we will have the slides available afterwards. Steve has shared the slides with us. We'll also have this recorded and shared via the association website as well as on our YouTube channel. So slides and presentation recording will be available. And again, I just want to apologize for the delay in getting started, as well as some of the technical difficulties that we experienced. So thank you again. The next question we have from Daniela. When you say before April 1st, 2020, when do the questionnaires begin to be sent out?
Yeah, I mentioned that before. So the Census Bureau will start the enumeration process early in 2020, in January, I believe, in remote areas of Alaska. And then by March, they expect to start sending out a set of mailings, several waves of mailings to households around the country. And we'll be doing that from March through April. And April 1, 2020 is the census date, the reference date for the census, because the questions on the census all say, on April 1st, 2020, where were you or are you living? And it's all based on that. So that's why the April 1, 2028. But the actual mailings that the Census Bureau does will begin before that.
Thank you, Steve. Next question, and for our current attendees, please send in your questions via the chat box. We'll go through each question. We have plenty of time, and Steve will be more than happy to answer these questions. So next question comes from, can you comment on what works to have undocumented people be willing to be counted? How can they feel safe doing so?
So this is a question that local organizations and elected officials and now complete count committees that are being formed are grappling with. Offhand, I'm not sure of the best approach, and there probably will be different approaches based on local knowledge of your communities and perceptions that exist in local areas. But I go back to this concept of trusted voices, trusted partners, trusted messengers, communicating the importance of being counted in the census and the importance of having a fair and accurate count for the decennial census, because of how fundamental the census data is in terms of political representation and federal, state, and local funding, and just counting us as a country. And so they'll be the ones who people more likely than not will listen to, rather than having the Census Bureau itself. The Census Bureau itself certainly will be getting this information out there, and other government agencies, but as an arm of the federal government, they might not be the most trusted messengers these days. So that's why local organizations are critically important. So they're on the ground, and as I said, right now they're all grappling with this exact issue and trying to figure out the best way of getting that message across. So it really will depend.
Next question comes from Gretchen. I know data is confidential and de-identified when reported, but if the citizenship question goes through and can be reported on by Census Tracts, could that increase risk that ICE agents might focus their efforts on tracts with high numbers of non-citizens?
Well, right now, the American Community Survey, which is an annual survey and a sample of the population, not a 100% count like the decennial census is, but the American Community Survey questionnaire asks a question about citizenship. So that information about the share of population by tract, it's an estimate, but it's the information about the share of the tract's population that was born elsewhere or is not a citizen, already exists. And so that information can be used by anyone for good or bad reasons that has access to the web and can download data from the Census Bureau. So I think the bigger issue is, will government agencies be able to use the information that individuals report, and your individual responses to the census questionnaire are confidential, and Title 13 of the U.S. Code protects those responses pretty rigorously. There's very steep fines for anyone who shares that information in any way beyond the Census Bureau's job to aggregate the data by larger geographies. You can go to prison, and it's very serious. So now people have said, well, could Title 13 be changed? I guess. Could people violate that confidentiality requirement? I guess anything is possible. But there are strong restrictions in place to prevent the individual responses from being used for anything other than aggregating the data for statistical purposes. So hopefully that won't happen.
Next question comes from Alan Leidner. We've estimated that every missed person costs their jurisdiction about $200. So there are real economic implications. So it seems like a comment that Alan wanted to share to the audience.
And it's a very good comment in terms of the economic implications, because census data is used to determine how federal funding for a variety of different programs is allocated, either on a state or local basis. I would just caution that, so research has been done that estimates by each program and overall and by state the amount of money that relies on accurate census data or relies on census data, whether it's accurate or not. I would just caution that you don't really want to use a per capita number, because it doesn't quite equate to a per capita. Like, in other words, if one person doesn't respond, it's not necessarily that, you know, that community will get a certain amount less. It's a shorthand way of estimating or talking about the implications of inaccurate census data, but you don't want to create the impression in people's minds that if, you know, one person doesn't respond, our community or our neighborhood will get that much less. But it, you know, again, the overall point is very strong, that if the census misses people or isn't able to count people or counts them incorrectly, that could have substantial impact, both with political representation and with federal funding being either allocated incorrectly or you know, communities not getting their fair share.
Next question comes from SEMA. It was mentioned that libraries are a good resource for those without Wi-Fi at home, but how will residents get library information? Will the form give them suggestions of the nearest public library, or is this up to local agencies?
That's a good question. I don't know if the Bureau, the Census Bureau itself, will be providing information about other ways where you can go to fill out the form online. I'm assuming that local organizations, it will be up to them to communicate that to local residents about the different ways that people can do that. That said, the Census Bureau will have area census offices and beat counter or questionnaire assistance centers throughout the country, and they'll also have a hotline where you can call to access information, and you could also, just as an aside, provide the information to your census questionnaire by phone, in addition to mail or online. So they might be able to provide that information. I don't know if they're going to proactively provide that. I think that the main effort to get the word out will be up to local communities, localities, and local organizations.
Next question comes from Karen. You mentioned overlays. Could an overlay of lack of internet access apply to the 2010 mail return data, provide a simple projection of hard-to-count tracts in 2020?
I don't know if that can provide a statistical projection, but we are planning to incorporate that type of overlay so people can at least make the visual interpretation of areas that didn't fill out their forms in 2010 and how that relates to areas that don't have adequate internet access now. So that is something we're planning to do, and at least so you'll have a visual way of coming to that conclusion.
Next question comes from Daniela. You mentioned outreach effort techniques. Any analysis of what types of media outreach outlets have worked?
So there's definitely been a lot of effort to understand how media outreach has worked in earlier censuses. There's been research on that, and actually the Census Bureau itself just released a report that based on a series of surveys and focus groups about, you know, how is the message getting out there to the public, and there'll be, you know, ongoing efforts like that. I know that the major civil rights organizations like NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, and the NAACP, and others are, you know, trying to craft their media outreach based on that prior research. So in terms of what exactly that means, I would reach out to them to see how they're planning to craft their messages.
Next question. In terms of the maps that were created, who are the intended audience, and how will they learn about the availability of the map? This is a question of team. I just sort of modified it slightly.
So the map, the intended audience is really anyone who is interested in helping to get the word out about the importance of the census and being counted in the census to help ensure a fair and accurate count in 2020. So for the most part, that is organizations that are working on this effort, although it could be used by individuals certainly, and could be used and has been used by the media and elected officials and complete count committees. How we're getting the word out about this, however we can. Presentations like this, I've given a couple of dozen webinars and in-person workshops and presentations around the country to specific communities and to nationwide associations, and we're going to continue to do that. And we have a growing list of organizations that want updated information about the map. So if you're interested, definitely go to the map, and there's an email in the contact option to let me know that you'd like to be kept informed. And if you can also help get the word out about this in your local communities, that would be terrific.
Next question comes from David. What applications do you use for data wrangling and map creation?
Whatever works. We use a variety of different things. We use everything from Notepad and Excel to SPSS, SQL Server, Postgres, in terms of data management and data analysis and data wrangling, as it were. And then for map creation, I would say that for the most part we are an Esri shop, as it were, but and CUNY, that's partly because CUNY itself has an institution-wide site license to all of Esri's software applications, which is really great and helpful. But we also use all sorts of applications, open source GIS applications. I'm a longtime MapInfo user, and so I use MapInfo still for a variety of different aspects. And as far as online map development, also that's a pretty broad mix of things. We rely on some ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Server resources. We use Mapbox, we use Carto, we use Google Maps, so whatever works. Oh, and I should point out also that in the information on the Census Hard-to-Count map itself, we do have a credit section that lists the different applications we've used and data sources.
Next question comes from Ted. I put together maps using the 2018 planning database mail return rate data for Westchester that uses block groups. So it looks a bit different from the CUNY maps that use tracts. Thoughts on whether to aggregate this to the tract level?
So we use the planning database as well, mainly for the mail return rate itself, because that, as far as I know, is the only place that provides local mail return rate data for the 2010 census. And the planning database is available from the Census Bureau by block group or by Census Tract. We decided to use the Census Tract version because we knew that we would be incorporating ACS estimates and there's concerns about how reliable the estimates are, even at the tract level and certainly at the block group level. So we thought the tracts would be a better unit, more broadly used unit for purposes of map presentation and data presentation. So the planning database, we don't have to aggregate it to tract. It already comes at the tract level.
Thank you. Next question. Do you know if Title 13 permits presidential executive orders to make Census Bureau hand over personal confidential responses?
Well, I'm not an attorney, and I don't know the ins and outs of how or whether executive orders can override these things. I assume they can't, but anything potentially, or lots of things are possible, and so I'm not sure. And but I should also mention that there are attorneys at national civil rights organizations that are looking at this very closely and have, developed white papers and documentation to reassure people that Title 13 is pretty strong. Congress or the president could try or do all sorts of things to undermine that. Hopefully they won't. But again, Title 13 itself is, from what the attorneys tell me, very strong and rigorous, and hopefully those protections will be preserved.
Do you know the source of data estimating the percentage of population or households without internet access beyond dial-up?
Yes. So we originally, when we developed the hard-to-count online map, we were using data from the Federal Communications Commission because they were the only ones that had tract-level data on internet access. But now with the 2013 to 2017 5-year ACS estimates from the Census Bureau, we're using that instead because it provides the information in a little bit more easily understood way. There are pros and cons to both, but the Census Bureau, and actually I don't know if people will see, can you see the map now that I just switched to? Well, when you go to the map and you click on a tract, in the left-hand panel there's a paragraph that says, the estimate of the tract's households that had no internet access, and then a link to the latest ACS estimates for that particular tract or for county or whatever, and it'll have the underlying data right there that you can access. And so the ACS has information on dial-up, broadband, cellular data plan, combinations of broadband access, satellite access, etc. So the ACS data is pretty robust in that regard.
And last question, we'll combine these two from Janet. Can one manipulate the data behind the interactive maps, example, selection, unions, and intersections? Also, the white papers that you mentioned or orgs publishing this, do you know where that information can be found?
So as far as the white papers and other research about census issues, Title 13 and the like, I would first go to the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and their census resource webpage has most, if not all, of that information and links to that information, and you can access that via the hard-to-count map. There's a resources link at the top of the hard-to-count map. And if you can't find something there, please contact me and I can help put you in touch with whoever has that information. And then we don't, as far as manipulating the data behind the map, we don't yet have the ability to download the data, but that's something that we do plan to incorporate, probably county by county, to be able to download the tract level information, as well as either a link to a shapefile for that county's tracts or a direct download for the shapefile. So you can't yet unless you contact me, and I'm happy to share the data with you, but eventually you will have the ability to access that information directly from the online map.
Thank you, Steve, and that concludes our Q&A as well as presentation. I want to thank Steve for his great presentation. If everyone in the audience can really show their appreciation for his time in the chat box, we greatly appreciate that. I'll leave that chat box there so that we can get some hopefully thank yous for Steve's great presentation. Thank you, Steve, and if you have anything else to add, please do so. I'm going to sign off the audio, but please go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you. It was really great to be able to give the presentation. Hopefully it was helpful information. Thanks, everyone.